Welcome, viewers and listeners, to another edition of Globespan 24x7, owned and operated and produced by Mr. Noor Singh, with technical support from Mr. Devin Bissoon. I'm your host and moderator, Vishnu Bisram. Tonight, we are discussing a continuation of a topic from last time with another moderator and different guests and presenters. We are talking about global poverty and interethnic challenges. We will be focusing on South Africa, Africa, the Caribbean, and other nations. With us tonight are three very, very distinguished speakers. Two of them you may have been familiar with, two of quite knowing faces, having appeared in this program many, many times, and they're both Guyanese. Our third presenter, speaker, guest is a gentleman who has roots in an Indian diaspora society, which I'll tell you about. Its name is Rajan Nasran. He was born in the UK. His parents were born, of all places, the Philippines. As I was discussing with him earlier, I visited the Philippines, and I don't recall ever meeting any non-Filipino, so to speak, when I was there a very long time ago. First, I'll give an introduction to Mr. Rajan Nasran, and then I'll talk about the other two presenters. Rajan Nasran is an award-winning explorer, journalist, and and content producer. Over the last 15 years, he has traveled to over 58 countries, bridging communities, cultures, and exploring the experiences behind our perception of identity. His work has been seen by audiences, and perhaps read as well, in excess of 30 million people, and he's known for his human approach behind the headlines. He's the senior partner of Nasran Rock and chief explorer for the Global Indian Series, an official platform for people of Indian origin, which has over 17 global ambassadors, including former heads of state, members of royalty, active ministers, through to leading business and international personalities. He is also international chair of the Wumba Center for Leadership Development in Africa, executive member of the Kenya Society, international sports director of the Corinthia football team of Malta. He sits on the board for the Mental Health Change Working Group of England, and he's a charter member of Rotary International Trade. His work has been endorsed by over 5 heads of state, the EBRD, through to members of the House of Lords, UK, and work cited in Time Magazine, the Indian Express, Miami Herald, and Shanghai Daily. He also does production for CNN, and if I'm not mistaken, I think what we refer to here as NBC. If I'm not mistaken, he will correct us on that one. So welcome, Mr. Rajan Nasran, to our program this evening. And with us also is Mr. Vincent Alexander, long-serving member of the Guyana Election Commission, and a background in politics, as well as the University of Guyana. And also with us is Dr. Bertram Ramarak, a professor at Suffolk Community College in New York State, Long Island, New York. Gentlemen, thank you all for coming, for spending your time with us this evening. Mr. Alexander, I want to thank you personally for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule. And Mr. Nasran, I know it's past midnight now, it's probably 1 in the morning in London. So thank you all for coming. We are going to watch a video about ethnic violence in South Africa, and then we'll get your comments, and then we'll move on, hopefully, to get to Guyana, where there are also ethnic challenges. Devin?
Is it true that the Indians were targeted in Durban and other places, or what is your view? Well, there are different ethnic groups. There's the Zulus, and there are others too. So how did that play out, the inter-ethnic thing in this time of crisis?
Awesome. So in South Africa, a Black South African means that you are Indian, colored, or African Black South African. So that's how we view Black South African. So basically everyone that does not fall into the white group. Another factor that played a key role in this was irresponsible use of social media. So, often on Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, someone sees one video of an old incident, not necessarily always in South Africa, not related to this looting, and they extrapolate from a sample of one that there is ethnic violence. My personal opinion is that Indians were not attacked. The latest estimates is 80% of businesses that were looted were Black African businesses. So in particular in South Africa, I don't really think this is ethnic clashes or related to different ethnic groups fighting against each other. The problem is poverty, inequity, unemployment, and a lack of jobs.
So, gentlemen, poverty leads to interethnic challenges, clashes. Do you agree? Rajan, I mean, you spent time in South Africa, and you travel quite a bit. What's your view to the presenter who said the Indian, African, and other ethnic groups clash because of poverty?
I think it would be nice for Mr. Vincent Alexander to go first. I know that he's got a head for politics and he sees the world in obviously a very good way. So I'll leave the floor to him first and I'll be happy to jump in after.
Okay. Vincent?
Thank you very much. I think that
we're going with seniority first.
I think, in fact, that poverty is a problem in itself, and it may lead to and exacerbate ethnic conflict. But that ethnic conflict does not necessarily have its origin in poverty, because the forces involved in ethnic conflict may be themselves the victims of poverty. And that what really happens is that in the development process, the evolution of the state, in many instances, a hierarchy of ethnic groups may have been established. I think in Guyana, one could speak to that as a source of the problem, that here we had the British, the Dutch come in, imposing themselves on the native people, and that was the commencement of the building of the hierarchy. Then they brought the people of African descent, enslaved, juxtaposed them at some point to the indigenous people, and expanded the hierarchy in that regard to 3 tiers, with the latest arrivals being at the bottom. And that process continued. So, for example, when the Portuguese came, of course they came injured, but were fixed into the social and economic structure in such a manner that they were in an advantageous position to the people of African descent and to the indigenous people. And so the hierarchy expanded. And the same pertained with the coming of the Chinese and the coming of the people of Indian descent. Essentially what happened, however, was that you had those who may be considered to be the exploiters and those who may be considered to be the exploited, but in a hierarchical arrangement. And the nature of the economic system imposed upon those at the lower rungs poverty. But what happens is that with scarcity, with the want for the various ethnic groups sometimes become involved in a struggle that sees pits one against the other, a struggle which probably in some regards was politically engineered by the colony in our instance, so they can continue to suppress the masses at large. And so what we end up is an interethnic rivalry in the face of domination by others, and in the face of poverty. So that what I'm saying, yes, where there's poverty, one may well find interethnic rivalry, but the rivalry is not because of the poverty itself, it is because of the established hierarchy, social hierarchy, which when confronted with economic problems, leads to rivalry for the distribution of the spoils.
Okay, let's watch another video. Dr. Ramharak, I know you studied ethnic politics as well, and ethnic conflict. You want to make a response to the video as well as to what Vincent Alexander presented?
Yeah, I know I guess I'm still not on video, but I think I'll blame my friend Vincent Alexander for hijacking me on my end. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Yes, we are.
Okay, so obviously in every society there's upper class, middle class, lower class, there's poverty. There is no single country that doesn't have any kind of poverty, but most of the conflict we're seeing today, most of the conflicts are not necessarily, where one country has a war with its neighbor. Most of the conflicts are, in a sense, internal. So you have these internal dynamics that are taking place where ethnic groups are asserting themselves, right? And that's what's happening around the world. Here in the United States, we see that whole protest with the Black Lives Matter and so on taking place. But we see other communities also gearing up and expressing their own identity. So, identity is an important character that defines politics today. I mean, we see that obviously in Guyana. But I do want to make a point about, what the young lady was saying, because you showed that clip. I happened to catch a part of the show last week, and I saw that statement that the young lady made, and I made a response. She did say that Indians were not being targeted, but we know, when you look at social media, which is a very powerful force, it can be a negative force, but it can also be a medium by which, we get access to information, right? And in many cases without context. But certainly we know that was a statement that was made in jest, and it's not true. We know, and maybe Rajan can confirm this. I was part of a show on Sunday that actually dealt with the impact of South Africa on the people of the Caribbean. And the speakers, who were primarily South Africans, made the point that Indians were targeted. And there's one place where we've seen, in a place called Phoenix, where I believe Phoenix is really a city in Durban. It's an area where primarily you have Indians who reside in that area. In fact, Phoenix was established by Mahatma Gandhi, who actually gave his land, and a sort of a community developed there. So when those people were being targeted, the roads were blocked, and there were no police or military folks on the ground. They decided that they would take matters into their own hand, and unfortunately, some of the rioters were killed. So it's not true or fair to say that Indians were not targeted. And of course, I do understand that, ethnicity, as I said, is a sort of a defining characteristic of politics around the world. It's no different in South Africa. And as we were talking earlier, one of the irony, which is a sad situation about South Africa, is South Africa, even for us, we have written about South Africa actually being a model for, developing a society based on, ethnic harmony and things like that. South Africa has a very elaborate constitution. They've come out of a situation where ethnicity was a major issue. We've talked in Guyana about, having a truth and reconciliation commission. They have gone through that process. But the problem in South Africa continues to exist. And in the case of us in the Caribbean, we do have our share, right? So my point is, I will support what, my friend Vincent is saying about, the correlation or the connection, I would say, between ethnicity and conflict and in terms of economic, deprivation and so on. So there is a connection between, being poor, right, and having that rebellious attitude to take what you don't have. And especially when you're dealing with a situation where you have, COVID and so on, that has been going on for years. So we're seeing something that's happening in South Africa that is not unusual where Indians reside in different parts of the world.
Were reasons preferred for the attack on the Indian community in Durban, Phoenix?
Is that for Rajan or?
No, for Dr. Ramharak. I mean, I'm sorry I missed that program, but just for the benefit of the viewers' audience, were any reasons preferred?
Well, from what we've gathered, right, the attacks were targeted on people who, who own businesses and so on. They have made arrangements to get access, for help from the state, but that sort of a help was not coming to them. So many of these people who felt targeted, they have decided to take matters into their own hand and defend themselves. Now they are being targeted or being labeled as vigilantes, and because they were simply defining who they are and establishing their right to defend themselves, they are now going to be charged, I assume, for murder, and you will have a case being brought against them. But everybody have a right to defend themselves, and I think that's what they were doing, because there were no help coming from the state. And I think the issue in Phoenix, that's the one that at least I have seen played out, and that's the one that was discussed on that show that I referred to on Sunday. So definitely there were some issues there where Indians were being targeted. I'm not saying Indians were the only ones targeted. There were other Black communities, who own businesses were targeted. The white community were also targeted. And of course, that situation continued, right? So that's the tragedy of what we're seeing in South Africa, Mandela's country, so to speak.
Yeah, and Vince Alexander did make the valid point that very often the poor people are victims of the violence as well. So poor people may attack poor people as well. Rajan, having heard the two esteemed gentlemen preceding you,
the two highly esteemed gentlemen. So I'm purely just a petal amongst all these roses. I think the whole South Africa issue, I'm going to do it justice by not beating around the bush either. And I think both gentlemen will appreciate my frankness. With the work that we do, we've always maintained that we work without fear or favor. And I think that's how we have to treat the media. When we look at the South Africa issue, we can talk about poverty, but again, every country does deal with its own poverty issues. Problem is, when you have this level of violence, you had just weeks prior to that, a political leader called Julius Malema, part of the EFF, turning around saying all Indians are racist. We should go to their shops. People don't belong to this country. And this whole notion of Africanization is no longer about Africa, as in you being born in Africa, but over the pigment of an arbitrary thing called skin color. Because again, we don't choose our skin color at birth. So this is what instigated it further. So now at the time, you have Zuma, who's about to go to prison for corruption charges. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff behind that. You got an area that is predominantly Zulu, which is in KZ, where obviously the riots took place. And I got a feeling, yes, it's politically motivated, but things got out of hand very quickly. But two and two together, the fact that you had a political leader stating out, Indians are not welcomed here. And the murders that took place were not just on one side, it was on both sides. You had people of Indian origin that were murdered in the streets, young kids that were shot dead. Houses were petrol bombed with families inside there. Businesses have been destroyed. But again, it wasn't just the Asian community. It was also the Black African community as well as the white African community. Everybody went through this. I do agree with the Honourable Mr. Alexander that there is a poverty issue here. But we also have to be pretty truthful. Poverty, is it about nutrition, about feeding your stomachs when you're in starvation? Or is it about stealing a television or the latest PlayStation 5? There's two different words of poverty there. A lot of people that were involved in those riots, I think, were opportunists. I would not class them as black, brown or white. I'll class them as criminal. They are not South African. Because the reality is neighbours have been there and they've had to learn to live together. The whole notion that there's never been ethnic tensions and everything's always been happy is not an accurate one. You had the Inanda riots that took place in the 1980s over there, prior to that in the 60s, a large anti-Indian sentiment. Now I also agree with Honourable Alexander, that the reality is we are ants on the back of a molehill. Nobody questions who's shaking that panel to make the different people fight each other. But when you got politicians who are harvesting votes, and the knee-jerk reaction to do that is blame everything on ethnicity because you got a lack of economic ability to dictate a service sector to get more people employed, well, then you know what you're going to get. The other issue is COVID. You've got a community there that are living from hand to mouth, and you put them on lockdown for a year. That's what you're attempting to do. So now you're putting them into a really bad situation. Who's to blame for that? Again, common sense is very rarely common, especially when it comes to roles of politicians, with example not being Mr. Alexander, because he is far more greater than I and he's taller than me, so I shall smile at him. But for traditional politicians, common sense is not very common. I want to say the reality is there was an element that was there that was anti-Indian. And I only say that because you have things on social media saying Indians must fall. And that when I can't wait for the Indian community to go back to school because we're going to kill the kids. I think the first presenter that you had on, the young lady that came from South Africa, she was very well intentioned for sure. She's there on the ground, but perhaps the rose tinted glasses that she was looking out on is something that's not available in the shops here in the United Kingdom. Because I can assure you that the mood on the ground was very, very different from there. We've got journalists on the ground in South Africa. We did podcasts where you can hear gunshots in the background. People were visibly scared. Families were distraught. These were communities there. And what's seriously disturbing is that this wasn't outside forces. This is communities that have lived next door to each other, all of a sudden going into this attack mode. What's more so frightening is the silence from the international media, the fourth pillar of democracy. Because as the good doctor mentioned, I was on the show on Sunday where we were speaking about this, and we had two of our correspondents on there. We didn't hear anything in the media. We were the first people to break the story about South Africa. And the reason why we wanted to do that is because we wanted people to know that this is a human rights abuse. This isn't about standing up and saying, as people of Indian origin, we have to do something to support them because they are our own similar ethnicity. No, it's not. It's a fact of what took place in South Africa was a human rights abuse. And a lot of people are to blame for that, mainly those people wearing suits. They're wearing Rolex watches, going into parliament, but at the same time, not supporting the very people that voted them in for a better future for tomorrow. You would hear violence in South Africa, but what you haven't seen is the videos in which you see people trying to protect their shops because they don't get the big insurance. We got goads of individuals bullying them, saying for them to shoot because they know as nightfall comes, what will take place after will be horrifying. South Africa issue is a very complex issue, but I think it'd be very foolish for us to binary down to just two skin colors. But I also think it'd be very foolish of us not to recognize that because of statements made by politicians in South Africa, in addition to things that were trending on social media, that there wasn't a racial element towards this, which is a shame. Because to me, the people in South Africa are South African, they're 7 generations in. India is not their home. They are proudly South African.
Did the politicians exploit the situation?
That will go on the basis that we have a great reliance on the integrity of politicians to do what is right for people. I dare say in the world in which we live, there's only probably a handful of politicians that have actually done and created the nobility that is in politics. I think when you got vote harvesting season, where your economy is going on a free fall, going on the way down, people are scared, you got higher unemployment. The easiest litmus test to do, the knee-jerk reaction is what? Create chaos in the ground. That's just my personal observation. I think the politicians let down the people of South Africa. To come on to the good doctor's point, the army did not come in for 7 days. Durban was burning. The army did not turn up. 65,000 army officials did not go into the streets. I got video footage of police officers in South Africa, not all, but a few, that were actually involved in the looting as well. So by the time the army actually turned up, it was too little too late. These people had no choice, and it was Asians, whites and blacks, so the true South African community, that were standing side by side to protect their homes against thugs. not against black South Africans, it was against thugs. It was a class divide that took place. People have exacerbated it, they've made the most of it, and they created this horrific incident where people have turned against people. We're human beings first, that's the reality of it. There's another story that the media didn't talk about, which is actually the other side, the cleanup, how communities came together to clean up Durban, to get rid of all the mess that was there. That showcases unity, that showcases social cohesion. You had a Sikh temple there. Oh, there's a lot of background noise there.
We're hearing you.
Okay, so those... Oh. There's a... there, it's gone now. So there was a Sikh community there. They have a Gurdwara, and it's a free kitchen, and their shops were burnt down. Their houses were petrol bombed. People died. And what they chose to do is, despite the food shortages, was to hold an open kitchen and to feed everybody without fear or favor. That was also reciprocated by the Christian community, the Muslim community, the Hindu community, the Jain community. The communities of South Africa came together in such a powerful way to showcase we will not be divided by stupidity. Unfortunately, that story was never showcased either. Again, what took place in South Africa is a human rights issue, but there was a racial element. But I don't believe in one moment that that racial element was really in the hearts and minds of the people on the ground. I think if we look at the evidence of weeks beforehand where politicians like Julius Malema were shouting out on the rooftops about ethnic tensions and division, well, we saw the practical embodiment of that, didn't we?
Okay, Vincent, you mentioned class issue. Vincent Alexander did say that the social structure of the society, in case of Guyana, for example, with the arrival of the Portuguese, the Indians, the Chinese, and other groups, resulted in this social structure of primarily color that created this class division within the society. And I suppose it's pretty much the same in South Africa as well. Would you agree?
No, I wouldn't. Not at all. I think we can say that as a historical aspect and say, of course, these things were there many centuries ago. Yes, South Africa is different from Guyana because apartheid only ended in recent history. So there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma. But people forget that, and despite what the lady said, South Africa, you have something called the BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, which the idea was good to say, if you're there, you can come in and educate yourself and get further in life. But the problem was, it was used and abused by different communities. So this, I don't buy into, at this moment in time, we have a new generation of people coming through South Africa who are getting educated. And then you have other communities in South Africa, because they don't meet the quota, have to leave the country that they were born in. So there's examples of a lot of doctors in South Africa, because they happen to be Asian, they had to study over in other countries like Mauritius, because they didn't meet the quota system. So I can't agree now that this big class divide is what caused what we saw now, the ruckus. I think that's a very knee-jerk reaction. It's a very educated assertion. But if you look at the streets and if you look at what's happened, I think the reality is the complacency of the government. They didn't put the policies in place. That's nothing to do with class. It's an easy get-out clause for a government to say, hey, we didn't do what was right for the country. We made promises, but we stole 100 million rand. So you have to be honest sometimes. You have to be common sense. But again, unfortunately, common sense is very rarely common in the world of politics.
Vincent Alexander, in response, did I quote you correctly? Did I interpret you correctly?
Mr. Alexander, can you just click on mute on the bottom left for us?
Click on mute. Vincent?
There you go. Click it one more time. I think you pressed it twice. Yes, there you go.
Right. I think that there are two factors that sometimes coincide and that sometimes are divergent when we are making this kind of analysis. Those two factors are people's material circumstances and people's psychological disposition. The class element may very well be associated with people's material circumstances. But not all people in a particular material circumstance would have a class disposition or a psychological disposition that coincides with those circumstances. And so there's a dynamic there. There's a dynamic there in that regard. But in the main, I would say that what occurs is driven initially by the material differential, but that it is not that alone that is the causal factor. A lot of the causation has to do with what is propagated from a historical and a contemporary perspective. And I think that is relevant to South Africa as much as it's to anywhere else. I will therefore agree that one has to attribute some of what happened to the political climate in South Africa. And much of what is being said, even in Parliament, by the opposition. And one of the problems you have in those circumstances is that the ANC, for example, finds itself against the wall with those kind of emotive politics, and therefore, even against their own best thought processes, do not react in the manner that is required because they seem to be of constituencies rather than of development. And so they find themselves in a competitive situation where they feel if they were to take the position which is not commonsensical for them to take, then they would be yielding political ground to other forces. So I'm saying that is a class element involved, and that leadership in some regards comes from that class element, but that even as there is a tremendous overlap between class and, in the case of South Africa, I would say the ethnicity or color, and I'm differentiating color now between white and off-white and black, collapse between those two things in some instances. For example, historically, the whites are the whites. Historically, though the rest are colored, the Indians can be differentiated from the blacks. And so, even in terms of the economic structures, there is some collapse between the class and the color configuration. And so it's a very intricate situation, but I would maintain that material circumstances is a critical driving element, and material circumstances are often aligned with class, but that in addition to material circumstances, psychological disposition then allows for people who may be materially in one class to be differently disposed because of the psychological disposition, and therefore one see the rivalry struggle as purely across the ethnic groups. It is across those who have a coincidental material and psychological dispositions.
Okay, with that, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll get a reaction or response from Dr. Bertram Ramarak and Mr. Rajan Nasran.
AllFromOneSupplier.com has launched preset value boxes. You can now save money when you order these preset boxes, which includes fish, meats, and pastries. Plus also cooked food like curry duck curry, curry goat curry, curry chicken curry, with dalpuri or bus-up-shut of your choice. Plus, if you're too busy to cook, All From One Supplier will ship your meals directly to your home. Now you can order all your West Indian groceries with your curry powder, pepper sauce, or your preset value boxes with all types of fish, duck or goat, and your pre-cooked meals like curry duck curry, goat, or bus-up-shut and dalpuri. We offer free shipping to all U.S. states and free delivery. So call us today at 718-551-3292 or visit us online at allfromonesupplier.com. Travelspan is pleased to announce Curry Duck Curry Punta Cana 2021. Yep, it's Travelspan Curry Duck Curry with an inclusive vacation 2-in-1 on August 12th to August 16th. Special performances by Terry Godraj, Sexy Marissa, the Tassamen, and the DJs are all going to Punta Cana on August 12th to August 16th. It's fun, games, party, and curry duck curry at VIK All-Inclusive Resort. All you can eat and all you can drink. Travelspan has flights from JFK, Newark, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, and Houston directly to Punta Cana. It's Travelspan Curry Duck Curry and an all-inclusive vacation. It's 2-in-1 on August 12th to August 16th in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. All-inclusive packages include air, hotel, transfers, all meals and drinks from $9.99 persons. Travelspan Curry Duck Curry is sponsored by allfromonesupplier.com. Dave West Indian. Call Travelspan at 212-243-0865. That's Travelspan at 212-243-0865 or book on travelspan.com. Globespan 24x7 continues.
Back, viewers, listeners, to this edition of Globespan 24/7, published, owned, and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Devin Bisoon as our technical operator. With us tonight, we have three very distinguished guests. Mr. Vincent Alexander, a regular face on this program, the former registrar of the University of Guyana and currently a member of the Elections Commission of Guyana. I don't know if he still describes or considers himself to be a politician, because Rajan Nasran somehow feels that most 95% of politicians are no longer noble. And we have with us Dr. Betaram Ramrak, professor of political science, history, social sciences at the Suffolk Community College in Long Island, New York, and Mr. Rajan Nasran, who was born in the United Kingdom but traveled extensively throughout Africa, and his parents are from all places, the Philippines. Welcome again, viewers, listeners. And so Mr. Alexander just spoke, and so get a reaction of Dr. Betaram Ramharak and then Rajan Nasran. Ramharak?
Yeah, well, I think one of the tragedy of with our historians and leaders is they speak a certain language, right? You can see that whether we were in Guyana or South Africa. They speak a certain language that tend to bring people together. But when passions do flare, they go back to their primordial sentiments and they become real and express who they are. And I think the other issue is that the question is, how do you look at the situation that you're dealing with? Now, one of the problem with the Marxist approach is that you tend to look at, ethnic consciousness or identity politics as something that's going to wither away. But what we're seeing, as I said before, around the world is that the Marxist approach, is good to a certain extent, right? We can look at, who's the dominant class and what are the issues facing the oppressed class and so on. But at the end of the day, it does come back to this whole issue of who controls power, right? Who governs, who make decisions, who make policies, right? And how those policies are affected and who benefit from those policies. So I would argue that one of the tragedy of our leadership, whether it's here in Guyana or elsewhere or in South Africa, is that, and I think the speakers are bringing that out, is that these leaders are sometimes not genuine in terms of what they're promoting, right? It's about interests, their specific interests, not the national interests, so to speak. But the other issue too is that, you know, if we can try to make relevance of what's happening in South Africa in terms of what's happening in other ethnically divided society, is that we're not trying to find real solutions, you know, that can bring groups together and really promote national policies. I mean, we have a country, Guyana, which is deeply divided, still very deeply divided. Definitely South Africa has been divided in terms of culture. You know, there's a long tradition of putting people into Bantustans or, you know, certain specific areas. So there was really no, you know, no national program to unify and bring these people together. But realistically speaking, there's only so far you can go. But the other point I want to make, aside from the fallacy of the Marxist perspective, you know, where race and ethnicity seems to be something you sweep under the rug, the other issue is that how do you move from A to B? How do you get from here to the next step, you know, where you bring people together? And that's the challenge. And I don't think that's necessarily going to come from the leadership, right? But the third point I want to make, and I think this for me is very crucial, because I'm saying the issue in South Africa, again, of course, it's not only Indians who are being targeted, but there is a history of Indians who live in the diaspora outside of India, you know, who have had substantial issue dealing with people who they live with in those societies, and their primary escape route is the flight, right? They leave. We've seen that in Idi Amin, Uganda in 1972, you know, where Indians were asked to leave the country. I believe about 60,000 of them left. Some came back. You know, we've seen situation in places like Fiji, for instance, you know, where there was a coup. Several coups actually, and in 1999, a person by the name of Mahendra Chaudhry actually became the first Indian prime minister. He was elected in Fiji, but then there was a coup against him, and the person, you know, who was behind the coup, he responded to Chaudhry's statement that, well, you're trying to create an apartheid system like in South Africa, in Fiji. And the response from the coup leader was that, hey, and that's okay, because we want you Indians to feel like the people of South Africa felt under apartheid. So my point is simply that we've adopted, and especially where the Indian diaspora exists, we've adopted a sort of approach, you know, where the escape route seems to be to leave, right? So that's as opposed to saying, look, let's work together and find ways. And I think this could go a long way also in Guyana, where if we can reach out from all sides, not just the issues between Africans and Indians, but we also have the Amerindians, you know, who could be part and parcel of that process. So there is a trend here that we're seeing. And I think South Africa, one of the lessons for me is that it is not an isolated situation. It's a sort of a history that's been repeated where Indians, you know, are living. But I do believe that in certain places, maybe South Africa may be an exception here, because they're, you know, out of 60 million people, Indians represent about 1.3% of the population, right? A very small population. But I think in places like Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, Fiji, there is a substantial number of Indians who can have an impact, regardless of who's running the country in those places. They do have, you know, clout in being a substantial part of the population, where they can actually force institutions or create institutions whether it's balancing the armed forces, whether it's adopting policies that has an impact on the different ethnic communities in those places. So I think that is something that is probably more more workable in places outside of South Africa. But then the question that leaves us is, well, what happens to South Africa? Where do we go from here? Given the fact that they have come a long way in terms of social experimentation with trying to create one of the loftiest progressive constitution there is. They've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where victims were expected to come out and talk about how their human rights were violated, and the perpetrators of the apartheid system were asked to come out and air your biases in public so you can have some kind of amnesty. But I think this is where in South Africa people have to kind of go back to that drawing board to try to look at where did they actually go wrong. Because the world is looking at South Africa. But I also think one of the things that we haven't really talked about here is that there has to be a role for international organizations, countries, that have relationship, with these countries where ethnicity is an issue. And I think there's also a role for them to play in terms of bringing groups together.
Rajan?
So I'm going to use the word of the Indian origin, but I'm going to say let's look at it in an anthropological way. So you've got a community of X. They were picked up and put into countries across the world. In most cases, people don't even realize, it was an indentureship through to trading, the Uganda, Malawi, Tanzania, Fiji Islands, so on and so forth. It could have been any community, but it just happened to be people of Indian origin because a large population of 1.2 billion at the time. You're in a country there where you have a dislocation of culture, language, and know-how. So therefore, you build up your own social networks. But what happens to any community is likewise of the Kenyan community that went to India, who suffered horrendously, or the Nigerian community that went to India. As communities, as small communities go, what tends to happen is that the larger influxes there tend to feel either scared because they're saying that new people are coming in to take our jobs. The same thing with Brexit debate here in the United Kingdom. And that's where the retaliation starts. I don't think the community have hid away from anything. I think in South Africa, they see themselves as South Africans. I think now the bigger questions posed for them saying, well, what is a South African, especially if you hear the spiel that's coming out here? Does it have to have a skin tone in order to be South African? But again, that could have been anybody. That could have happened to the African community. It could have happened to the Chinese community, anybody, just migration of people. Uganda issue, because I've heard this come up a few times. 80,000 Indians were kicked out of Uganda. Yes, they lost their businesses and it was horrific. 500,000 Ugandans were murdered by Idi Amin. They lost their lives. So again, what happened in Uganda wasn't just anti-Indian, it was anti-Ugandan. Idi Amin was not an Africanist in any sense whatsoever. He murdered brutally 500,000 Ugandans in torture chambers. Is a side of history that we don't often speak about, or the Jewish community that were kicked out prior to that. So we have to be very careful the way that we look at history in order to determine where we are right now, because if we take away just the skin color aspect, which is again just an arbitrary fluke to who we are, it's not a personal brand, it is the skin at the end of the day, and we look at migration of people, then we can see what the themes are. South Africa now is a rose-tinted glasses that we can sit here amongst us all, and I take it back. I would not class Alexander as a politician. I'll class him as a diplomat. Diplomats, by far, are in higher esteem than the mainstream politicians. But what I'll say is, when we have a look at South Africa amongst us, it's very easy for us to say, well, we now need to put a forwarding step. We need to rehabilitate. We need to heal. We need to come through. Now, Sierra Leone did that on the back of the civil war, and they did it well, because they had no choice, economically speaking, where they were and where they had to go. They had to get that momentum. Rwanda did it incredibly well. But you had a leader like Paul Kagame who came in. You don't get many people like that. Now, you got the case of South Africa, and they couldn't do it just immediately after apartheid. Everything was dropped under the carpet. And I dare say, even now, give it another 3 weeks or 4 months or 5 months or 6 years, nothing will change. Everything will be brushed underneath the carpet and it'll be things back to normal. And I don't think that's because the people's intention. I think it's just easier for politicians who are in for 5 years to do that because everything's short-term thinking. So that's my notion on the area. We have to stay away from the skin color aspect. We run the Global Indian series, so you kind of think that we're going to be covering everything, say it's the success of the Indian origin. It isn't. What we cover is the human interest and looking at the human condition. What does identity truly mean in the countries we call home? Is this an arbitrary factor that we're brown? We could have been any skin color. It's just taking a look at migration, saying what happens when you take communities forcefully, like the British did, and put them across the globe and then walk off and then add another community in there because you want to change the way that slavery looks like and make it more modernized, but still put people in the same conditions. So that's why I think we need to have a mind change over it. South Africa is complex, but it's complex because of political circle there, or probably more fairness, the political circus there is highly complex and they do that intentionally. And I think that's what it is. This could have happened in any other country. I agree with what the doctor said. Fiji, Malaysia, Malawi in the past, Tanzania, Kenya, this thing does breed its head. It's happened across the globe. And it's just a shame because it seems that it's about immigration. It seems about the new people that arrive in the country. Same thing happened to the Nigerian community in South Africa. People don't talk about that. Nigerians were murdered in the streets. Where was black economic empowerment there? Where was Julius Malema's fist in the hand? We had Nigerian students that were killed there. The Kenyan community was scared in South Africa. That's why I know that there's more Zimbabweans. Yeah, it's terrible. This is not about black anymore. It's not about that. There's something fundamentally wrong when you get politicians who are allowed to go on stage and cause this much division and get away with it. I think if we're going to point our fingers anywhere, it has to be towards them. Because if you wish to be voted in, because you're supposed to be showcasing a better community for all, then you better do the job. Otherwise, I would see it as being fraudulent. That's my viewpoint on it.
Okay, we'll get back. We'll come back to that for a solution. But let's hear Vincent Alexander. Vince, do you agree politicians exploit the conflict?
I would agree with politicians.
And you can apply to Guyana as well.
I would agree that politicians do exploit the conflict. But to put it that way suggests that they're exploiting something that may be latent, and therefore they're not necessarily the originators of the factors at play, but they do exploit and can exploit them. But I want to make some provocative comments based on what has been said so far. Rajan has argued the point about white Indians and blacks all being South Africa. When we argue that point, is it? They're all South Africans from the standpoint of citizenship as a nationality. I hope I'm not playing with words here. Citizenship as opposed to nationality.
Okay.
What do you mean by that, Alexander?
Well,
because I can see a telltale smile there, so I think that there's something else behind.
I would pose the problem this way: are there Chinese other than Chinese in China?
Oh God, you're becoming a poet again. We had a conversation about your Shakespeareanness.
Other than Indians in India.
Okay, so
the problem you're faced with here is that there's a place called Africa that dated with original inhabitants. And now we're arguing that, and I'm being provocative here, and we're arguing that all who inhabit South Africa are South Africans. Is that argumentation global? Is it universal?
I'm really glad that you brought this up.
China, Chinese.
No, I'm really glad that you brought this up. Can I respond?
Less in those places, all who inhabit Indian are the Indians, and so that's another becomes a little problematic. So I'm posing this as something that one needs to, see one of the dynamics that pose some of the problems in terms of disaggregating in a situation where Rajan is aggregating all into one. But I do agree that the immigration is a critical question. We have seen this starkly in Germany with the Turks. So it's a universal question. We've seen it with Mexicans in the USA, where when these societies have their problems, they turn to say, you're the source of our problem because you're taking up the opportunities that we should be having. So that's another element in the complex, and I'm saying it's equation that we are faced with. The question of response came up. And again, that question of response may place us at the spot of juxtaposing nationality to citizenship, because an Indian in South Africa may not have the same attachment to that place as place of origin. You may have it as place of belonging, but not necessarily a place of origin. And may in fact still see India as a place of origin. And this could relate to any set of people. And so even in a country like Guyana, when you're faced with problems, it is not very difficult for us to say we are leaving this place. Because we came to this place for purpose. The purpose seemed not to be realized, and we go somewhere else for purpose. While the indigenous people, so to speak, don't relate to the place from the standpoint of purpose. They relate to the place from the standpoint of ownership. And so the disposition is different. And ownership not in a physical sense, ownership in a spiritual sense, And so this is a very, very complex situation that we're dealing with. And the equation to deal with this, I don't know that we have as yet. You talk about simple equations and quadratic. I think this is far greater than any of those equations. And we probably at this stage, we're still trying to find which are the factors in the equation rather than a resolution to the equation.
Oh, there you go again, Vincent. You sound like a poet once more.
But Mr. Alexander, indigenous people also migrate to other societies. I mean, Indians from India migrated elsewhere. The indigenous people of Guyana have migrated abroad to US, Canada, and elsewhere.
I think those migrations took place at a different time, and took place at a time when the question of boundaries and borders and not, so they owned the earth at that time. Now we seem to have gotten to a point where you own a particular space from an indigenous perspective. Well, so yes, initially they came across the Bering Straits, but
well, may I ask a question then, Alexander?
Type of migration was fundamentally different.
Well, I was going to say, Alexander, what skin color is an African to you then? Because I think that's what you're hinting at here.
No, it can't be a skin color. It can't be a skin color.
But you're saying indigenous. So if we look at South Africa, then if we go on your equation...
Why it can't be a skin color is for this reason. Even if you go back to the original inhabitants of Africa, which in itself is not homogeneous with its climatic conditions, one sees differentiations in skin color.
So then what to you is an African?
Huh?
What do you term as an African?
And in the context of the problematic I pose, I would say an African would be one who can find lineage, original peoples.
But then if we're all born in Ethiopia, like people say, that we're all from Africa, the first human fossil was found in Ethiopia, then don't we all have lineages in Africa then? Am I not African or?
In that regard, we all human
beings. Is that too far back then?
In that regard, we're all human beings, not all Africans.
Absolutely. So we're all human beings,
but
right?
We have had eras of evolution that has differentiations and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
because of the interest of time, you have just about 15 minutes left. Dr. Ramrak, you have any point on this one?
Yeah, I think Vincent is playing a game here that can, that can be a little dangerous. So here's the thing: when we talk about citizenship, we're talking about what legal rights you have as a person basically born in a country. When we talk about nationality, it's not just about race; it's about culture. Right? It's about your common history, your background, and things that you share with a specific group of people. So what I'm trying to get at here, I mean, when you look at South Africa, for instance, whether Indians came, in 1860, or whether they came in the 1990s when you had that second wave, the point is there were many Indians who considered themselves South Africans. There's no distinction between, what they say and do. In fact, there were Indians who fought along with Mandela, side by side, hand in hand, and many of those Indians, at least some of them, were being treated as if they were not South Africans. So if we use that analysis now and make the argument that, well, these people were here first, these others came later, they were less Africans, then we could say in the case of Guyana, myself and Vincent should not have the same rights as the native Amerindians who were there. The point is, these people have been there, they've helped develop.
We don't have the same rights. We don't have the same rights.
Well, what I'm saying, if we use the logic that, the Native Americans are much more connected to the land. They were there before us. The point is, you have invested a generation and a second generation and a third generation, and you've built, right? So therefore, we all should be entitled to the same rights. So even when in an ethnic situation, one group should not be pitted against the other, right? So there should be no such thing
entitlement.
And so I want to add on to that because
Mark, just let me make the point. I have posed this as a problematic. I have not.
No, I understand that. I think the speakers do.
I pose it as a problematic. Yeah. I think it's a problematic worthy of consideration.
It is worthy of discussion. Yes, I agree.
Listen, it's problematic because that's one of the arguments that's being made, towards the communities in various parts of the world, especially when it comes to dealing with Indians in South Africa. That statement, has a lot of meaning because people don't see them. They see them as people who are interlopers. They came here to exploit the people in Africa. So that's a real feeling. It's not just a problematic, as we may say.
Well, I have posed it as a problematic based on perceptions which are extant reality. Deal with it.
Listen, I want you all. I just want to shift focus a little. I do have a video for you to watch, and then we'll get your comment.
Transpired in the city. Now there are social networks. All of us have got phones. We read here on social networks. There was a voice note which was circulated. That voice note says, "Go and loot all shops in malls everywhere. Once you are done with that looting, go to Indian areas." Not me saying that, I'm saying the call says that. Go to Indian communities, go there and kill Indians and burn their houses. Go to white areas, go there once you are done with looting, go there and kill white community, then and burn their houses. Then that call has landed to our ears. Then now the community started to fear for their own lives. In hearing that, they started to put initiatives in place. How are we going to protect our lives? Because this thing is going to happen. Not that they haven't seen incidents. They've already observed incidents happening. That this thing is coming. That means it's true. They mobilize themselves, private security companies, committee members. Even myself, because as a mayor, I've been stopped.
So there you have it. A speaker was quoting a Zulu nationalist politician imploring fellow Zulus to go out and kill Indians and whites, burn and loot their properties and so forth. What's your reaction to that? Rajan,
I'm gonna go first with this. I think I know what Mr. Alexander was saying was a hypothetical situation, saying about nationality, ethnicity, and citizenship. But I dare say that belief, not his, but that chain of thought is what led to comments like that. Because therefore people are saying, well, hang on, these communities are not mine. We should go out there and we should do that because they're the others, they're not us. What that statement indicates to me is a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding, but also political gain. Now, the damage that was done within 7 days, just to put it in perspective, cost over 20 billion rand. It will take decades for those businesses to be rebuilt. Forget about the infrastructure, jobs that have now been lost, livelihoods that have disappeared, all because you had leaders that were turning around saying, go loot them, go kill those people, do this, because they're not seen as citizens here. The Indian community have been in South Africa since the 16th century, not the 18th century, 16th century, many generations deep. I get what Mr. Alexander is saying. You have it in every culture. You can have an Indian in Uganda, or you can have Ugandan Indian, two very different things. Likewise, you can have a Kenyan British or a British Kenyan, two very different things. The reality is the communities have been there for so long that they are part of the fabric of it. And as the doctor said, they fought side by side to end apartheid. What is the point of fighting for equality if that equality is not for all? That statement there is a scary statement because it's felt across the globe, not just to people of Indian origin, but it's to every form of minorities in countries where now they are shaking in their boots. We've seen the same things happen in places like Latvia, where you have the rise of the right wing. We've seen it happening in France. Again, in Poland. So it's politicians, those who have got not the nobility in mind, they do not operate without fear or favor unless money is involved. That is a problem with that statement. Is a true statement. That's what I said when your first speaker came on saying that this was not an Indian thing. She was wearing rose-tinted glasses that is not available to anyone else apart from her own private subscription.
Betram?
No, I mean, I made the point, and I think, you know, it is a dangerous situation when you have speakers making that kind of statement. There was another person who was a major player in South African politics, Julius Malema. He had made some statements saying that, well, you know, not all Indians are racist, but most, and he did emphasize the word most. So I don't know what most means, but these are statements that are coming out, and I come back to the point I made earlier, which is that Indians, in a sense, are left in a situation where they have to find ways to defend themselves. And at the same time they have to work with people who live in those societies and also make demands where you can actually change the institutions that would guarantee their rights as well as the rights of others. I'll give you a simple example. Reading the Guyana papers today, I saw a letter. You know, we have been always arguing, for instance, in a situation like Guyana, that the ethnic, you know, composition should be reflected in the arms of the state, right? The security forces. We see a movement taking place in the United States where people are calling for, you know, policing or police to reflect the community population, you know, that the police you know, where they work. But in the letter today, we have someone saying, well, we don't need to, you know, to balance the armed force or the police force. That's a statement that ought to be challenged because, everybody, whether you're Black or Indian or Chinese or Portuguese, ought to be able to have the opportunity to provide security for everyone and defend the country against invaders and whatever. But security forces and so on should reflect the composition of the population, because we've had situation, where security forces can be used as arms of the state, especially in Guyana. But of course, that's a little different from South Africa. And I think in the case of South Africa, where Indians are in a sense, and again, I'm speaking from that perspective, I'm not saying they're the only ones being persecuted. They have to also form alliances with other groups, whether it's Black organizations or white organizations and so on, to kind of find ways to work things out, to create that harmonious society that we talked about. Or you also have to look at outside forces that can play a role. In the case of Guyana, we've had the United States playing a major role in trying to, to promote that level of democracy that people voted for. And I think in the case of South Africa, the unfortunate thing is, especially for Indians, is that India has not been willing to play a supportive role. In fact, you look at social media, people are asking the question, well, what can India do for us? Especially given the situation that they're faced with. But India is nowhere in the scene. They've made a very tepid, through their High Commission, a very soft statement, calling for an end to the violence. But given the gravity of the situation, India also needs to play a role. International organizations, human rights organizations, African nations also need to play a role in condemning the atrocities, not just against Indians, but whites and other South Africans and so on. And we don't see that really happening. And I think that is essentially what is missing in this equation.
Vincent?
I think it's important. That kind of statement is unacceptable. It's challenging civility. It's challenging civilization. It's unacceptable. But having said that, I think that there are some things we ought to pay attention to as well. The hard lines that are sometimes drawn in plural societies can be attributed to institutions that themselves are not seen to be a source of problem. In a plural society, there are natural processes of integration, which scientifically may be referred to as pluralization. Some people use that word in a very derogative sense, but pluralization is a natural process. So in a plural society where you do not interfere with people's rights to be diverse, but similarly you do not have institutions that seek to push back its natural pluralization, then there is a greater possibility of the realization of all citizens being Africans. Because it is that these institutions, because it's a cultural issue we're dealing with now, it's these institutions that by virtue of creating silos that in fact keep people who can be aggregated, disaggregated. And so I think that's another factor that one has to look at in this process. Very often attention is not paid to it, and it seems to operate more in the background, but it's critical to the continuing, sometimes even physical segregation. And I think that we ought to look to countries like Malaysia to see what they have done to overcome the problems of the Malays and the Chinese and things like that, in attempt to see how natural processes rather than social engineering by the politicians or social engineering by other institutions or social state by other institutions, do not in fact interfere with natural processes, which processes may have earlier existed in those earlier days of migration, but which now are obstacles to people's intuition.
Well, that's definitely a tongue twister, isn't it? Malaysia's not as harmonious as you may think it is. They've had riots there. They've changed government in the last 3 years a number of times. So it's definitely not there. I just
my reference is the ethnic harmony.
There is not ethnic harmony there though, because you got a movement in Malaysia saying Malaysia is for Malays. There's no ethnicity harmony. You got people under there that are scared.
They have become some that ethnic conflict that very often reared its head, and they seem to be a degree of tolerance and coexistence. That's from where I stand. That's how I
would love to talk about Guyana. I would love to talk about Guyana and the conversations I've had with several of your former ministers, with your former Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu, who I do know very well, through to obviously dealing with your former Minister of Finance and some of the things that he said to me that I found incredibly disturbing. But I know that we don't have enough time to discuss that. But maybe in the future, if we could talk about that, I'll more than welcome that discussion.
So gentlemen, we just got a couple of minutes left. So any final points? Rajan, Dr. Ramarak, and Vincent.
In that order, or?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it was a very good discussion, and I like the fact that on this platform we can operate with that fear or favor. And I know that we all are colorblind when we're discussing this, which is important. And I think if we were to take that notion and understand that our skin color is just an arbitrary factor to our human condition, I think we can actually look at each other as humans. There's no other species on this planet that treats each other this ridiculously poor, and we're one of a trillion species on the back of the same planet. If we can't learn to live together as human beings, well, we probably don't deserve to be alive in the first place. So that's my thought process on things. I know it's a very high level thinking of that, but it's something that is very true to who I feel.
Yeah, but what Vincent was saying, if I understood him right, was that we need to look at a society where there is harmony. It doesn't necessarily have to be Malaysia. Singapore, for example, is a good example for me. I mean, it's a somewhat semi-authoritarian state, but there's relative harmony there in Singapore. Dr. Ramaran? Yeah, sorry, you want to comment on that?
I was going to say, do you know what? There's one society that I've been to that I thought that it was really interesting. That was Ethiopia, because there's religious harmony there. You walk through and you see the Coptic monks along Christians, Jews, Muslims, and you can see that there was none of that racial tensions. Obviously, they're going through the whole tribal issue. So it showcased that harmony does exist. Is there, if we allow people to do what they naturally do, maybe we have to rethink the way that we look at politicians.
Well, that was my point. Allow people to do what they naturally do. That was my final.
Okay. Ramarak?
Yeah. Well, hopefully my camera will work the next time we meet, so I can, you guys can see me. Well, anyway, you know, we spend most of our time here talking about South Africa, and you know, and for good reasons, because as I said, I know South Africa is complex. It has a different history. It's a different country, but there are some commonalities that, you know, that we need to look at, especially in our own context as a Guyanese. We need to find solutions, you know, that can bring people in Guyana together. The country, whether we like it or not, is still divided. It's ethnically divided, and hopefully we can find, you know, some solutions. We have proposed a number of them in the past, but as I said, South Africa has some, you know, some commonalities in the sense that it is a culturally diverse society. You know, they have done a lot when it comes to constitutional engineering. I know there are groups of people in Guyana who are talking about, you know, the fact that changing the constitution But you know, every constitution is good as the people who live by those constitutions. It's not just going to be constitutional change. People's attitude have to be changed also. And I think in terms of policy, South Africa also does offer some commonality or some things we can look at in terms of policy. You know, when you look at the preamble of the constitution, they talk about bringing people together and so on. And I think that has to come with recognizing, you know, that you're living in a diverse society, and not just policies, but institutions. Institutions have to reflect everyone, right? It has to reflect who we are. So having said that, we will all be looking at South Africa, and hopefully they can, you know, find a way to get back to some semblance of normalcy, and the country can progress.
Mr. Alexander?
As human beings, we are undoubtedly at one, and that's a biological perspective. What's perspective? Over time, there has been a differentiation and a disaggregation of human beings, and so in ways and means to have a conversation in various places between those disaggregated groups that would allow us to see that, notwithstanding the differences, that we have commonalities and that we are in a sense on one planet, and if we don't in country or on planet work collectively, then though we see ourselves as being different, we will be destroying our very selves by those acts of disaggregation.
With that will be the final word. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure hosting you all tonight. I thank you for this very, very informed, brilliant conversations and discussions that we had tonight. For Rajan Nasran, I know it's 1:30 past your bedtime in London. I thank you for staying up this late to join us. Mr. Vincent Alexander, Dr. Betaram Ramrat, you have been watching Globespan 24/7, owned, operated, and produced by Mr. Noor Singh, with Devin Bisoon as our techie operator tonight. I'm your host, moderator, Vishnu Bisram. Thank you again for watching and spending your time with us this evening.
Thank you.